What if I told you that one US president kept an alligator in the White House bathtub, another got a speeding ticket for riding his horse too fast, and one literally taught his parrot to swear so loudly it had to be removed from his funeral? Yep, behind the marble monuments, the serious portraits, and the history textbooks, America's commanders in chief were secretly wrestling champions, whiskey distillers, bartenders, fashion models, and occasionally just deeply, deeply weird people trying to survive the hardest job on earth. So here's what we're going to do. Over the next few hours, we're going to uncover 99 weird, wild, and completely true facts about US presidents that history sort of forgot to mention. Before we start, if you enjoy falling asleep to bizarre history narrated by someone who's genuinely shocked, these facts are real, consider subscribing. Maybe hit the like button if your eyes are still open. And if you make it through all 99 facts without dozing off, congratulations, you've just earned a degree in presidential weirdness. Now settle in, get comfortable, lower that screen brightness. Seriously, why is it still on maximum? And let's talk about the men who ran America while hiding alligators, losing China in poker games, and occasionally just trying not to get killed by their own parrots. Starting with the father of our country, who had a very firm policy about handshakes. Chapter 1: The President Who Wouldn't Shake Your Hand. George Washington, the first president of the United States, had a peculiar habit that would seem bizarre today. He absolutely refused to shake hands with anyone. Instead, Washington would bow formally, like a powdered wig statue come to life. This wasn't mere eccentricity. Washington believed handshaking was too common and undignified for a head of state. He preferred the elegant, distant formality of a bow, keeping everyone at arm's length, literally. Imagine approaching the father of your country, extending your hand eagerly, only to watch him bend stiffly at the waist instead. It must have felt like being rejected by a very polite mannequin. This presidential quirk set a standard of dignified distance that Washington maintained throughout his 2 terms. But of course, that wasn't the only unusual thing about our first president's personal habits. Chapter 2: Washington's Disturbing Dentures. George Washington's dental troubles were legendary. By his inauguration in 1789, he had only one natural tooth remaining. His solution? Dentures crafted from a disturbing variety of materials, including teeth extracted from other people. These weren't just any teeth either. Some came from enslaved people at Mount Vernon, purchased from them for cash. Others were salvaged from cadavers or purchased from the poor. Washington's dentist, John Greenwood, fashioned these ghastly sets using human teeth, cow teeth, hippopotamus ivory, and metal springs. The result was painful, ill-fitting, and gave Washington's famous stern expression a practical explanation. He wasn't being stoic. His mouth hurt constantly. These dentures also changed the shape of his face and affected his speech, adding physical discomfort to the weight of leading a new nation. And speaking of presidential peculiarities that involved unusual companions, Chapter 3: Adams and His Hellhound. John Adams, America's second president, had a dog with perhaps the most unfortunate name in presidential PETA history: Satan. Yes, that was actually the dog's name. Adams was known for his prickly personality and stubborn independence, so perhaps naming his canine companion after the Prince of Darkness was fitting. The dog reportedly roamed the grounds of the Adams family home in Quincy, Massachusetts. Unlike modern politicians who carefully curate their pets' names for public relations, Adams apparently gave zero thought to how Satan might sound to voters. Then again, this was a man who famously said unpopular things without filter. So why should his dog's name be any different? Adams and Satan were apparently inseparable companions during the former president's retirement years. But while Adams kept controversial company with his four-legged friend, another founding father was revolutionizing How Presidents Actually Sat Down. Chapter 4. Jefferson's Revolutionary Furniture. Thomas Jefferson wasn't just drafting documents that changed history. He was designing the furniture he sat in while doing it. Jefferson created his own swiveling chair, complete with a rotating seat and adjustable height. Historical evidence strongly suggests he wrote significant portions of the Declaration of Independence while seated in this ingenious contraption. The chair represented Jefferson's mind perfectly: innovative, practical, and always looking at problems from different angles. Literally. He could spin around to reach books, adjust his height for writing comfort, and work for hours in ergonomic ease. This wasn't some crude wooden spinner either. Jefferson's design showed sophisticated understanding of mechanics and human comfort. The original chair still exists today, preserved at the American Philosophical Society. It's a testament to Jefferson's belief that even small innovations could improve daily life. And speaking of Jefferson's attention to practical details in ambitious projects, Chapter 5. The Chocolate Expedition. When Thomas Jefferson commissioned Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, he ensured they were well supplied. The expedition's keelboat carried scientific instruments, weapons, trade goods, and something unexpected: 55 pounds of chocolate. That's right, nearly 60 pounds of pure cocoa packed alongside compasses and rifles. Chocolate wasn't a frivolous luxury. It was considered a valuable nutritional supplement, providing quick energy and morale boosts during the grueling journey westward. The expedition members used it as a trade item with Native American tribes and as emergency rations when other food ran scarce. Jefferson understood that exploring thousands of miles of unknown territory required not just courage and maps, but also creature comforts to sustain hope. Lewis and Clark's chocolate supply showed presidential leadership included thinking about what kept men going when everything else failed. But not every president had Jefferson's tall, commanding presence. Chapter 6. Madison. The pocket president, James Madison, stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, making him the shortest president in American history. This literal founding father was pocket-sized, weighing barely 100 pounds throughout his adult life. Madison's slight stature became almost comical when he stood beside taller colleagues. At state dinners, guests sometimes initially mistook him for clerk or secretary, but what Madison lacked in height, he made up for in intellectual firepower. He's called the father of the Constitution, for good reason, having authored much of that document and the Federalist Papers. His wife, Dolly Madison, towered over him by several inches, especially when wearing the elaborate turbans she favored. Foreign diplomats often expressed surprise upon meeting the diminutive figure who wielded such enormous political influence. Madison proved that presidential power had nothing to do with physical presence. Meanwhile, his successor had his own peculiar relationship with the past. Chapter 7. Monroe's Fashion Time Capsule. James Monroe absolutely refused to update his wardrobe. Decades after the Revolutionary War ended, Monroe continued wearing the knee breeches, buckled shoes, and tricorn hat of 1776. By the 1820s, these clothes were hopelessly outdated. Imagine seeing your president dressed like your grandfather's grandfather. Monroe looked like he'd stepped out of a history painting directly into the White House. This wasn't poverty or absent-mindedness. Monroe made a deliberate choice. He saw his Revolutionary War-era clothing as a badge of honor, a visible reminder of his service during America's founding. While other politicians adopted modern pantaloons and top hats, Monroe clung stubbornly to his antiquated wardrobe. Foreign diplomats found it peculiar. Citizens found it either charmingly patriotic or embarrassingly behind the times. Either way, Monroe kept dressing like 1776 until his death in 1831. But his successor's morning routine was even more shocking, literally. Chapter 8. Adams' Naked Morning Ritual. John Quincy Adams maintained a morning ritual that would scandalize modern Secret Service agents. Every day, weather permitting, the sixth president would wake at dawn, walk to the Potomac River, strip completely naked, and swim for an hour or more. This wasn't discreet skinny dipping in some secluded spot. Adams swam openly in the river, entirely nude, sometimes accompanied by his valet, who also swam naked. Adams believed this daily exercise maintained his health and mental clarity. Once, a female journalist allegedly sat on his clothes on the riverbank, refusing to leave until he granted her an interview. Adams, trapped naked in the water, supposedly complied. Whether this story is embellished remains debated, but Adams' nude swimming habit is well documented in his own diary entries. He kept up this practice well into his 60s, and his peculiar relationship with aquatic activities didn't stop there. Chapter 9: The Bathtub Alligator. John Quincy Adams kept a truly bizarre pet during his presidency, an alligator housed in the White House bathtub. The alligator was a gift from the Marquis de Lafayette, the French military hero who'd fought alongside Americans during the Revolutionary War. Adams kept the creature in one of the White House's unfinished East Room bathtubs, where it lived for several months. Imagine being a White House guest needing to use the facilities and encountering a live alligator instead. Adams apparently enjoyed showing off his unusual pet to startled visitors, finding amusement in their shocked reactions. The alligator eventually was relocated, though records don't specify exactly where it ended up. This wasn't even the strangest presidential pet in White House history. That distinction probably belongs to the next president's foul-mouthed companion, whose vocabulary would make a sailor blush, and whose behavior at a solemn occasion became legendary. Chapter 10: Jackson's Cursing Parrot. Andrew Jackson taught his pet parrot, Paul, to swear like a drunken soldier. The bird learned an impressive repertoire of profanities, which Jackson apparently found hilarious. Paul lived with Jackson for years, picking up the president's rough vocabulary and explosive temper. The bird's finest, or worst, moment came at Jackson's funeral in 1845. As mourners gathered to pay respects to Old Hickory, Paul began shrieking obscenities so loudly that attendees had to physically remove the bird from the service. A Presbyterian minister later recalled the parrot swore so loudly it could be heard outside. Imagine the scene: somber mourners in black, tearful eulogies, and suddenly a parrot screaming curse words at maximum volume. The incident perfectly captured Jackson's irreverent, combative spirit. Even in death, Old Hickory managed to shock polite society. But not every presidential legacy involved such dramatic disruption. The next president's claim to fame was considerably more bureaucratic. Chapter 11: Van Buren, the first true American. Martin Van Buren holds a unique distinction among presidents. He was the firstborn after American independence, making him the first president who was never a British subject. Everyone before him, Washington through John Quincy Adams, was born when America was still a collection of British colonies. Van Buren entered the world on December 5, 1782, in Kinderhook, New York, nearly 7 years after independence was declared. This made him the first president who grew up knowing only American citizenship, never owing allegiance to King George. Van Buren's Dutch heritage also made him the only president whose first language wasn't English. Growing up in heavily Dutch Kinderhook, young Martin spoke Dutch at home before learning English later. This colonial-era bilingualism became increasingly rare as American culture homogenized. Van Buren represented a new generation entirely shaped by American identity rather than colonial memory. And his hometown would give him another, more lasting linguistic legacy. Chapter 12: The Birth of OK. Martin Van Buren popularized one of the most ubiquitous expressions in the English language, OK. During his 1840 re-election campaign, Van Buren's supporters formed OK clubs, standing for Old Kinderhook, referencing his New York hometown. The abbreviation caught on like wildfire, spreading beyond political circles into everyday speech. While some linguistic evidence suggests OK had earlier origins, Van Buren's campaign turbocharged its popularity. Suddenly, everyone was saying things were okay, meaning satisfactory or acceptable. The phrase spread globally, becoming perhaps America's most successful linguistic export. Today, OK exists in virtually every language on Earth, recognized from Tokyo to Timbuktu. Few people know they're referencing a 19th century president's nickname when they use it. Van Buren lost that 1840 election badly, but his linguistic legacy endures. Speaking of election campaigns, the next president's inaugural address started his term memorably, though it ended disastrously. Chapter 13, Harrison's Fatal Speech. William Henry. Harrison delivered the longest inaugural address in presidential history on March 4th, 1841. He spoke for 1 hour and 45 minutes, totaling 8,445 words. The weather was cold and miserable. Harrison, wanting to project strength and vigor at age 68, refused to wear a coat or hat. He stood in the freezing rain reading his interminable speech about classical history and Republican virtue. Then he rode on horseback through the inaugural parade, further exposing himself to the elements. Within days, Harrison developed a cold that worsened into pneumonia. Doctors tried everything, including bloodletting and crude medications, but nothing worked. Exactly 1 month after his marathon inaugural address, Harrison died, serving the shortest presidential term in history. His famous last words were supposedly, "I wish you to understand the true principles of the government. I wish them carried out. I ask nothing more." From longest speech to shortest presidency, Harrison's ironic legacy was complete. Chapter 14. Tyler's extraordinary fertility. John Tyler fathered 15 children, an American presidential record that still stands. His reproductive career spanned an astonishing 55 years. Tyler's first wife, Letitia, bore him 8 children before her death. He then married Julia Gardner, 30 years his junior, who gave him 7 more children. His youngest child was born when Tyler was 70 years old. The truly mind-boggling fact, 2 of Tyler's grandsons were still alive in the 21st century. Lyon Gardner, Tyler Jr., and Harrison Ruffin, Tyler, lived well into the 2000s, creating a living link spanning 3 centuries. Think about it. President Tyler was born in 1790, during George Washington's presidency. His grandsons died in the 2010s, during Barack Obama's and Donald Trump's presidencies. 3 generations connected the founding era to the iPhone age. Tyler's extraordinary longevity through his descendants makes him history's longest-reaching president. But Tyler's successor put his stamp on White House culture in a far less prolific way. Chapter 15, Polk's no-fun policy. James K. Polk banned dancing at the White House. Yes, he was that guy. Polk and his wife Sarah were devout Presbyterians who considered dancing frivolous and potentially sinful. When they moved into the White House in 1845, the music stopped, literally. White House receptions became notoriously dull affairs. Guests stood around making strained conversation while military bands played dirges. Foreign diplomats accustomed to lively European court balls found Washington's social life under Polk excruciatingly boring. Sarah Polk enforced the no dancing rule ruthlessly, believing the presidential mansion should project moral seriousness, not levity. The Polks also banned alcohol and card playing, turning White House social events into what one visitor called about as lively as a Quaker meeting. Despite this oppressive social atmosphere, Polk accomplished significant policy goals, including westward expansion. But his joyless White House reflected his workaholic personality. He literally worked himself to death, dying 3 months after leaving office, exhausted. Chapter 16. Taylor's deadly dessert. Old Rough and Ready himself may have been killed by fruit and dairy. On July 4th, 1850, During a fundraising event for the Washington Monument, Taylor consumed large quantities of raw cherries and iced milk on an exceptionally hot day. Within hours, he developed severe stomach cramps. His condition rapidly deteriorated into what doctors diagnosed as cholera morbus, likely acute gastroenteritis. Taylor died 5 days later, on July 9th. For years, historians accepted this explanation. Spoiled cherries and cold milk on a hot day caused fatal digestive upset. However, some modern researchers have speculated about arsenic poisoning, though Taylor's body was exhumed in 1991 and tests found no evidence of foul play. The most likely explanation remains the original. Taylor's aging digestive system couldn't handle the combination of acidic fruit, dairy, and July heat. He survived Mexican War battles unscathed, but was defeated by desert. His sudden death elevated Vice President Millard Fillmore, who would make his own modest contribution to White House history. Chapter 17. Fillmore's Bathroom and Innovation, Millard. Fillmore installed the first permanent bathtub in the White House. Before 1851, presidents who wanted to bathe had to use portable tin tubs filled by servants hauling buckets of heated water. Fillmore, ever the modernizer, commissioned a proper bathroom with a fixed bathtub and primitive plumbing. This wasn't a luxurious spa-like affair by modern standards. The tub was essentially a large basin with drainage, but it represented progress. Interestingly, Fillmore wasn't the first president to encounter indoor bathtubs. John Quincy Adams had one installed earlier, but it was removed. Fillmore's version stuck, becoming permanent White House infrastructure. The installation sparked some controversy. Critics called it an extravagant waste of money and un-American luxury. But Fillmore persisted, and future presidents gratefully inherited proper bathing facilities. This modest improvement to presidential hygiene was perhaps Fillmore's most lasting legacy, overshadowing his controversial political career. But bathroom installations were dignified compared to the next president's inaugural day disaster. Chapter 18. Pierce's memorable disaster. Franklin Pierce delivered his entire inaugural address on March 4th, 1853, completely from memory. No notes, no teleprompter. Pierce recited 3,319 words perfectly, an impressive feat of memorization. His speech addressed national unity and constitutional principles, delivered flawlessly in freezing weather. Afterward, Pierce attended inaugural balls and celebrations where things went spectacularly downhill. The new president got absolutely blackout drunk, to the point where witnesses described him as incoherent and barely able to stand. His excessive drinking wasn't limited to inauguration night. Pierce battled alcoholism throughout his presidency. His wife Jane despised Washington and refused to attend most social functions, leaving Pierce isolated and drinking heavily. His single term was marked by poor decisions and political disasters, many made worse by his drinking problem. Pierce's presidency deteriorated so badly that his own party refused to renominate him in 1856. From memorization triumph to drunken disgrace in one day, that was Franklin Pierce's trajectory. Chapter 19. Buchanan, the Bachelor President, James. Buchanan remains the only lifelong bachelor to serve as president. He never married, living his entire 77 years as a single man. This created a unique situation. Who would serve as White House hostess? Buchanan's solution was appointing his niece, Harriet Lane, as First Lady. The orphaned daughter of Buchanan's sister, Harriet, had been raised by her uncle and became his official hostess. She was young, charming, and immensely popular, bringing much-needed grace to Buchanan's troubled administration. Harriet's tenure as substitute First Lady was so successful that popular songs and several ships were named after her. She later married and became a significant philanthropist. Buchanan's bachelorhood sparked endless speculation. Modern historians debate whether he was gay, asexual, or simply preferred solitude. His close friendship with Alabama Senator William Rufus King was particularly intense. Andrew Jackson once referred to them as Miss Nancy and Aunt Fancy. Whatever the truth, Buchanan took it to his grave, leaving only questions behind. And questions surrounded the next president too, though his physical prowess was legendary. Chapter 20, Lincoln the Wrestler. Abraham Lincoln was a frontier wrestling champion with an almost undefeated record. In over 300 matches, Lincoln reportedly lost only once. His gangly 6'4" frame and enormous strength made him nearly unbeatable. As a young man in New Salem, Illinois, Lincoln regularly competed in rough-and-tumble wrestling matches that combined grappling with bare-knuckle elements. His most famous match was against Jack Armstrong, the local tough guy. Accounts vary, but Lincoln either threw Armstrong decisively or fought him to a draw so impressive that Armstrong's gang, initially hostile, became Lincoln's loyal supporters. Lincoln's wrestling reputation earned him respect in rough frontier communities where physical courage mattered enormously. The National Wrestling Hall of Fame honored Lincoln as an outstanding American in the wrestling category. Years later, political opponents who underestimated the prairie lawyer discovered he was tougher than he looked, both physically and politically. Lincoln's wrestling days proved valuable training for the brutal political fights ahead during America's bloodiest conflict. Chapter 21, The Girl Who Changed. Lincoln's face. Abraham Lincoln grew his famous beard because an 11-year-old girl suggested it in a letter. Grace Bedell wrote to Lincoln during the 1860 presidential campaign, telling him he'd look better with whiskers because his face was too thin. She added that all the ladies like whiskers, and they would convince their husbands to vote for him. Lincoln actually replied to Grace's letter, gently teasing that people might think it a silly affectation to grow a beard mid-campaign, but then he did it anyway. By the time of his inauguration in March 1861, Lincoln sported the full beard that became iconic. He even stopped in Grace's hometown of Westfield, New York, during his inaugural train journey, stepped off to meet her, and reportedly said, "You see, I let these whiskers grow for you, Grace." One child's letter changed presidential imagery forever, but not every president cared quite so much about appearances, though the next one certainly cared about his wardrobe, for very practical reasons. Chapter 22. The president who tailored his own suits. Andrew Johnson made his own clothes, including the suits he wore as president. Before entering politics, Johnson worked as a tailor in Greenville, Tennessee, and he never lost his sewing skills. Even in the White House, Johnson occasionally mended his own garments and took pride in his tailoring abilities. He'd learned the trade as an apprentice at age 10, bound to a tailor after his father's death left the family destitute. Johnson's tailoring background shaped his political identity as a champion of working people against aristocratic elites. He often reminded opponents that he'd risen from poverty through honest labor. When political enemies mocked his humble origins, Johnson wore his tailor past like a badge of honor. Throughout his contentious presidency, he was impeached but acquitted by one vote. Johnson maintained that working-class dignity he'd learned behind a needle and thread. But while Johnson sewed his way into history, another president was racing through it. Literally. Chapter 23, Grant's Need for Speed. Grant received a speeding ticket for riding his horse too fast through Washington streets. The Civil War hero who'd commanded armies and accepted Lee's surrender got busted by a police officer for reckless driving, equestrian style. Grant was notorious for his love of fast horses and faster riding. One day, he was racing his horse and buggy down M Street when Officer William West stopped him. West recognized the president but issued the citation anyway, a $20 fine. Grant reportedly respected the officer's integrity, paid the fine without complaint, and even walked back to the White House rather than risk another ticket. Some accounts suggest this happened more than once, with Grant repeatedly unable to resist the urge to speed through city streets. His need for velocity got him in trouble with local law enforcement multiple times during his presidency. And speaking of Grant's uncontrollable habits, his tobacco consumption became legendary in a very different way. Chapter 24. The Cigar President, Ulysses S. Grant loved cigars so obsessively that after the Civil War, grateful citizens sent him thousands. Following his victory at Fort Donelson in February 1862, newspapers published an image of Grant with a cigar clenched in his teeth. Almost immediately, admirers began mailing him cigars by the boxful. By war's end, Grant was receiving over 10,000 cigars annually from well-wishers. Before the war, Grant smoked about one cigar daily. After the publicity, he smoked up to 20 per day, working his way through the massive stockpile. This excessive cigar habit likely contributed to his death from throat cancer in 1885. Grant spent his final months racing to complete his memoirs, writing through excruciating pain to secure his family's financial future. He finished the manuscript days before dying, creating one of history's finest military autobiographies. His cigar obsession brought him pleasure, but ultimately helped kill him. The next president took a decidedly different approach to presidential vices. Chapter 25. Lemonade, Lucy, and the Dry White House. Rutherford B. Hayes banned alcohol from the White House entirely. His wife, Lucy Hayes, earned the nickname Lemonade Lucy for serving non-alcoholic beverages at state functions where wine and liquor had traditionally flowed freely. Lucy was a devout Methodist and temperance advocate who believed alcohol was morally corrupting. The Hayes administration's dry policy scandalized Washington society. Foreign diplomats accustomed to wine with dinner found White House receptions bizarrely sober affairs. Some guests reportedly pre-gamed before attending presidential events, knowing they'd get nothing stronger than lemonade inside. Critics mocked the policy, but Hayes supported his wife completely. Interestingly, some evidence suggests White House staff occasionally smuggled alcohol into Roman punch desserts, spiking the supposedly innocent treats without Lucy's knowledge. Whether Lucy ever discovered this deception remains unclear. The alcohol ban lasted Hayes's entire term, making his presidency Washington's soberest 4 years. But Hayes's successor possessed talents that didn't require any intoxication to seem unbelievable. Chapter 26. Garfield's ambidextrous genius. Garfield possessed an extraordinary talent. He could write Latin with one hand and Greek with the other hand simultaneously. This wasn't party trick exaggeration. Garfield genuinely could compose sentences in 2 dead languages at the same time, using both hands independently. He occasionally demonstrated this ability for amazed visitors. Garfield was intensely intellectual, having worked as a classics professor before entering politics. He read voraciously in multiple languages and could engage in complex philosophical discussions in ancient Greek. His ambidextrous writing ability revealed remarkable neurological coordination. Most people struggled to pat their head while rubbing their stomach, but Garfield could compose sophisticated prose in 2 languages simultaneously. Tragically, his brilliance was cut short. Just 4 months into his presidency, Charles Guiteau shot Garfield in July 1881. Garfield lingered for 80 agonizing days before dying in September, likely killed more by his doctor's unsanitary probing for the bullet than by the bullet itself. His successor proved far less intellectual but considerably more fashionable. Chapter 27. Arthur's extravagant wardrobe, Chester A. Arthur changed his wardrobe daily and owned over 80 pairs of pants. The man was a clothes horse of legendary proportions. Arthur refused to wear the same outfit twice in 1 week and insisted on having the finest tailoring available. He employed a personal valet whose primary job was managing the presidential wardrobe. Arthur's fashion obsession wasn't mere vanity. He believed dignified appearance reflected presidential stature. Before becoming president, Arthur had been a Manhattan lawyer and Republican power broker who frequented society parties, and dressed the part impeccably. Upon unexpectedly ascending to the presidency after Garfield's assassination, Arthur redecorated the entire White House, auctioning off wagon loads of old furniture he considered beneath presidential dignity. His fashion sense extended to midnight suppers, fine wines, and European furnishings. Critics called him shallow, but Arthur actually proved a surprisingly effective reformer, championing civil service reform despite his machine politics background. He looked good while doing it too, in 80 different pairs of pants. Meanwhile, his successor would prove unique in an entirely different mathematical way. Chapter 28. The President Who Counted Twice. Grover Cleveland served 2 non-consecutive terms, making him simultaneously the 22nd and 24th president. He won in 1884, lost to Benjamin Harrison in 1888, despite winning the popular vote, then came back to defeat Harrison in 1892. This unprecedented feat meant Cleveland appears twice in presidential numbering. Technically, he's one person but 2 administrations, creating endless confusion for history students memorizing presidential sequences. Cleveland remains the only president to achieve this comeback. His first term was marked by reformist zeal and vetoes. He vetoed more bills than all previous presidents combined. After his 1888 defeat, Cleveland returned to private law practice in New York, but he never stopped positioning for a rematch. His 1892 victory made him the answer to trivia questions forever. Cleveland's unusual tenure wasn't limited to electoral math, though. During his second term, he pulled off a deception that would have destroyed modern presidencies if discovered. Chapter 29. The Secret Surgery. Grover Cleveland secretly had cancer surgery aboard a yacht during a financial crisis. In June 1893, doctors discovered a cancerous growth on the roof of Cleveland's mouth. The nation was spiraling into economic panic, and Cleveland feared that news of presidential illness would trigger complete financial collapse. So he arranged the most covert medical procedure in presidential history. Doctors operated on Cleveland aboard the yacht Oneida as it sailed through Long Island Sound. They removed his entire upper left jaw and most of his hard palate, replacing it with a rubber prosthesis that allowed him to speak normally. The surgery was performed entirely inside his mouth, leaving no external scars. Only the surgical team, Cleveland's closest advisors, and a few family members knew. The press was told Cleveland was vacationing. When he reappeared days later, speaking normally, no one suspected major surgery. The secret held for decades. Journalists eventually discovered the truth, but only after Cleveland's death. His deception, though medically successful, raises serious questions about presidential transparency. But at least Cleveland knew how to use modern technology, unlike his predecessor. Chapter 30. Harrison's Electric Fear. Benjamin Harrison was the first president to have electricity in the White House, installed in 1891. However, Harrison and his wife Caroline were terrified of electrocution and refused to touch the light switches themselves. They had White House staff turn lights on at dusk and off at dawn. If no servants were available, the Harrisons would rather leave lights burning all night than risk touching the switches. Their fear wasn't entirely irrational. Early electrical systems were dangerous, prone to sparking and shocking users. The White House installation was cutting-edge technology, which made it experimental and unpredictable. Wires ran haphazardly through the mansion, and switches occasionally gave nasty shocks. Still, the image of America's president afraid to flip his own light switches struck many as ridiculous. Harrison's electrical timidity contrasted sharply with his military background. He'd been a Union general during the Civil War. He'd faced Confederate bullets without flinching, but couldn't bring himself to operate a light switch. His successor would prove considerably braver, though a small superstition would have fatal consequences. Chapter 31. McKinley's Fatal Carnation. William McKinley wore a red carnation on his lapel daily for good luck. He'd worn one throughout his political career, considering it his personal symbol. McKinley regularly gave carnations to well-wishers and visitors, sharing his lucky charm generously. On September 6th, 1901, at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, McKinley gave his carnation to a young girl in the receiving line. Minutes later, as McKinley greeted visitors, Leon Cholgos stepped forward with a pistol concealed under a handkerchief and shot the president twice in the abdomen. McKinley died 8 days later from gangrene and infection. The timing was eerie. The one time McKinley gave away his lucky carnation, he was shot. Whether this was coincidence or fate, people noticed. The red carnation became associated with McKinley's memory and later became Ohio's state flower in his honor. His assassination elevated Vice President Theodore Roosevelt to the presidency, unleashing a force of nature into the White House. And Roosevelt would prove nearly impossible to stop, even with bullets. Chapter 32, The Unstoppable Bull Moose. Theodore Roosevelt gave a campaign speech after being shot in the chest. On October 14th, 1912, while campaigning for a third presidential term on the progressive Bull Moose ticket, Roosevelt was shot by John Schrank outside a Milwaukee hotel. The bullet penetrated Roosevelt's chest, but was slowed by his steel eyeglass case and 50-page speech folded in his breast pocket. Roosevelt coughed into his hand, saw no blood, and concluded the bullet hadn't reached his lung. He refused immediate medical treatment and insisted on delivering his scheduled speech. Roosevelt spoke for 90 minutes, telling the shocked crowd, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose." He showed them his bloodied shirt and the bullet-pierced manuscript. Only after finishing did Roosevelt allow doctors to examine him. The bullet remained lodged near his rib for the rest of his life, too dangerous to remove. Doctors marveled at his luck and stamina. This wasn't even Roosevelt's most dangerous White House activity, given his aggressive approach to exercise and wildlife management. Chapter 33, Roosevelt's Rough White House. Theodore Roosevelt practiced boxing, judo, and wrestling inside the White House. He installed gym equipment and regularly sparred with military officers, cabinet members, and anyone willing to fight him. Roosevelt once took so many punches from a military aide that he went blind in his left eye, a fact he concealed from the public for years. Undeterred, Roosevelt switched to judo, earning a brown belt from Japanese instructors. He'd wrestle in the White House library, do judo throws in the East Room, and box in the State Dining Room. Roosevelt also dealt with an unusual White House problem. His children kept bringing animals inside. The Roosevelt children accumulated guinea pigs, badgers, raccoons, a bear, a lion, a hyena, snakes, and a pony that once rode the elevator to visit Roosevelt's sick son upstairs. The White House essentially became a zoo during Roosevelt's tenure. Between hand-to-hand combat and animal management, Roosevelt's presidency was physically exhausting. His successor faced different physical challenges, though significantly less active ones. Chapter 34, Taft's Bathtub Problem. William Howard Taft had a custom bathtub installed in the White House, one large enough for 4 men. Taft weighed over 300 pounds and famously had difficulty with standard bathtubs. The president ordered a massive porcelain tub measuring 7 feet long and 41 inches wide, specially designed to accommodate his considerable size. A famous photograph shows 4 White House workmen sitting comfortably inside the tub together before installation, demonstrating its enormous capacity. Stories that Taft actually got stuck in the original White House bathtub are likely exaggerated or apocryphal. No contemporary accounts confirm it happened. However, the fact that such stories seemed plausible reflects how Taft's weight dominated public perception of his presidency. He struggled with his size constantly, trying various diets without lasting success. His weight issues overshadowed his considerable intellect and legal expertise, but Taft would eventually find a position perfectly suited to his judicial mind and didn't require fitting into bathtubs at all. Chapter 35, Taft's Supreme Career. William Howard Taft remains the only person to lead both the executive and judicial branches of government. After losing his 1912 re-election bid to Woodrow Wilson, Taft returned to legal academia. In 1921, President Warren Harding appointed Taft as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a position Taft had always wanted more than the presidency. Taft thrived as Chief Justice for 9 years, far happier than during his miserable presidential term. He modernized the court's procedures, pushed for the construction of the Supreme Court building, and wrote over 250 opinions. Taft later admitted, "I don't remember that I ever was president." This wasn't false modesty. Taft genuinely found greater satisfaction in judicial work than executive politics. His presidency had been dominated by impossible comparisons to Roosevelt, his predecessor and former friend turned bitter rival. But on the court, Taft could finally excel on his own terms, using his legal brilliance without political pressures. Meanwhile, his presidential successor found creative wartime solutions to White House maintenance. Chapter 36, Wilson's Woolly Groundskeepers. Woodrow Wilson had a sheep herd mow the White House lawn during World War I. As the nation mobilized for war in 1917 and 1918, Wilson wanted to demonstrate patriotic sacrifice and efficiency. He ordered a flock of sheep to graze the White House grounds, instead of employing gardeners for lawn maintenance. The sheep kept the grass trimmed while groundskeepers could pursue more essential wartime work. Wilson even auctioned the wool these sheep produced, raising $52,000 for the Red Cross. Around 18 to 20 sheep grazed the presidential lawn for approximately 2 years. Tourists found it charmingly rustic. Some critics called it undignified. But Wilson's sheep represented practical wartime symbolism, the president sharing in national sacrifice. The sheep departed after the war ended, and professional groundskeepers returned to their mowers. Wilson's presidency would end badly with his stroke and failed League of Nations crusade, but his sheep at least contributed positively. The next president's White House activities were considerably less wholesome or patriotic. Chapter 37, Harding's Poker Catastrophe. Warren G. Harding once lost the White House china in a poker game. Harding loved gambling and hosted regular poker parties in the White House, often playing late into the night with political cronies. During one particularly disastrous game, Harding bet and lost an entire set of historic White House china, irreplaceable presidential tableware accumulated over decades. His wife Florence was reportedly furious when she discovered what he'd done. The incident perfectly captured Harding's presidency, casual corruption and poor judgment disguised as good-time bonhomie. Harding's administration became synonymous with scandal after his death. In 1923, revealed the Teapot Dome affair and other corrupt dealings by his appointees. The poker games weren't harmless fun. They symbolized how Harding's Ohio gang cronies treated government as a personal casino. Harding himself probably wasn't personally corrupt, just spectacularly bad at choosing associates and saying no to friends. His gambling habit extended beyond cards to his entire approach to governance, and the nation lost that bet. His successor was Harding's complete opposite in temperament and verbosity. Chapter 38, Silent Cal's 3 words. Calvin Coolidge rarely spoke, earning the nickname Silent Cal. Stories of his legendary taciturnity are countless. The most famous incident occurred at a dinner party where a woman bet she could get President Coolidge to say more than 3 words. She told him about the wager. Coolidge replied simply, "You lose." That was it, 2 words, and she had indeed lost. Coolidge's silence wasn't shyness, it was calculated. He believed words should be used sparingly and only when necessary. His press conferences were exercises in minimalism, with Coolidge deflecting questions through terse non-answers. Once, when asked if he had any comment on prohibition, Coolidge responded, "No." A reporter persisted. "Can you tell us anything about the Farm Bill?" "No." "Can you tell us anything at all?" "No." Reporters eventually gave up. Coolidge thought Calvin's silence was presidential dignity. Critics thought it was laziness. Either way, Silent Cal spoke volumes through saying nothing. though he did find ways to stay physically active in his own peculiar way. Chapter 39: Coolidge's Mechanical Horses. Calvin Coolidge had mechanical horse machines installed in the White House for exercise. These contraptions were early versions of exercise equipment designed to simulate horseback riding. Coolidge would sit on these devices and bounce up and down as they moved beneath him, supposedly getting cardiovascular benefits without leaving the White House. Photos of Coolidge on these mechanical horses look utterly ridiculous. The stern-faced president bouncing sedately on a stationary contraption. But Coolidge took his health seriously and believed these machines were effective. He also enjoyed actual horseback riding and took a mechanical bucking bronco device along during his summer vacation in South Dakota in 1927. The president would ride his mechanical horse while wearing full business attire, including suit and tie, adding to the absurdity. These mechanical horses represented 1920s fitness culture, bizarre gadgets promising easy exercise. Coolidge embraced them earnestly, never acknowledging how silly he looked. But at least Coolidge's eccentricities were openly visible, unlike his successor's linguistic secrets. Chapter 40: Hoover's Private Language. Herbert Hoover spoke Mandarin Chinese with his wife, Lou, in the White House to keep conversations private. The Hoovers had both learned Mandarin while living in China from 1899 to 1901, where Herbert worked as a mining engineer. They became fluent enough to conduct complex conversations in Chinese, an unusual skill for Americans of that era. In the White House, whenever the Hoovers wanted to discuss sensitive matters around staff, visitors, or reporters, they'd switch to Mandarin. No one else in the building understood what they were saying. This linguistic privacy fence allowed remarkably candid discussions in public settings. Lou Hoover was especially accomplished in Mandarin, having studied it more formally than her husband. The Hoovers also spoke Latin to each other occasionally, though their Chinese was more fluent. Their language skills reflected their genuinely international background. Hoover had worked worldwide before entering politics. He brought global perspective to the presidency just as America's economy collapsed into the Great Depression, launching the worst crisis since the Civil War. Chapter 41: Roosevelt's Million Stamp Obsession. Franklin D. Roosevelt collected stamps obsessively throughout his life, amassing over 1 million stamps by the time of his death. This wasn't casual hobby collecting. FDR devoted hours daily to his stamps, even during World War II. He'd spend evenings in the White House residence, examining new acquisitions through a magnifying glass, organizing them meticulously. Roosevelt began collecting at age 8 and never stopped. His collection eventually filled hundreds of albums. He particularly loved stamps featuring ships, birds, and early American postal history. FDR even influenced stamp design during his presidency, personally approving artwork and suggesting subjects. His Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau once joked that FDR spent more time on stamp designs than economic policy. After Roosevelt's death in 1945, his widow Eleanor sold the collection. It fetched over $200,000 at auction, a substantial sum then. Roosevelt's stamp obsession provided mental escape from polio's physical limitations and presidential pressures. But stamps weren't his only creative solution to his disability's challenges. Chapter 42: The Hidden Elevator. Franklin D. Roosevelt designed a secret wheelchair elevator concealed inside a White House fireplace. FDR contracted polio in 1921 at age 39, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. He could never walk unassisted again, though he went to extraordinary lengths to hide his disability from the public. Roosevelt used a wheelchair constantly, but was almost never photographed in it. The White House presented accessibility challenges, so FDR commissioned a small elevator disguised within a fireplace between floors. The contraption was cramped and purely functional, but it allowed Roosevelt to move between levels without being carried by staff where visitors might see. This elaborate deception reflected the era's attitudes toward disability. Roosevelt feared Americans wouldn't trust a wheelchair-bound president during crises. The hidden elevator symbolized both FDR's ingenuity and the exhausting pretense he maintained for 12 years. His successor would prove equally protective of family, though far more publicly combative about it. Chapter 43, Truman's Furious Letter, Harry S. Truman once wrote a scathing letter to a music critic who insulted his daughter Margaret's piano and singing recital. In December 1950, Washington Post critic Paul Hume published a brutal review of Margaret Truman's Constitution Hall concert, writing that she cannot sing very well and is flat a good deal of the time. Truman, reading this over breakfast, became absolutely furious. He grabbed White House stationery and handwrote a blistering response. I have just read your lousy review. I never met you, but if I do, you'll need a new nose and plenty of beefsteak. The letter threatened physical violence, completely unpresidential behavior. Truman mailed it himself from the White House. When the letter became public, reactions split. Some found Truman's Papa Bear protectiveness endearing. Others thought it shockingly inappropriate for a sitting president. Truman never apologized, saying any father would defend his daughter. The incident revealed Truman's Missouri scrappiness never fully yielded to presidential dignity. His successor brought different passions to the White House, particularly on the lawn. Chapter 44, Eisenhower's Putting Obsession. Dwight D. Eisenhower installed a putting green on the White House lawn and used it constantly. Ike was golf-obsessed, playing over 800 rounds during his presidency. The White House putting green, installed in 1954, allowed him to practice whenever he had spare moments. Eisenhower would rush out between meetings to sink a few putts, sometimes in suit and tie. The green became his stress relief, and exercise rolled into one. Squirrels repeatedly damaged the putting surface, digging holes and burying nuts. Eisenhower became so frustrated with these furry saboteurs that he ordered them trapped and relocated. White House staff waged ongoing war against squirrels throughout Ike's presidency. The putting green survived long after Eisenhower left office, with subsequent presidents either maintaining or removing it based on their own golf interest. Nixon removed it, Ford restored it, and it's been there ever since. But Eisenhower's presidential innovations extended beyond landscaping into transportation. Chapter 45, Eisenhower Takes Flight. Dwight D. Eisenhower became the first president to ride in a helicopter on July 12, 1957. The flight covered a short distance from the White House to an airport, but it revolutionized presidential transportation. Before helicopters, presidents were confined to cars and trains for local movement, making them vulnerable to traffic and security threats. The helicopter offered unprecedented mobility and security. Eisenhower initially hesitated, concerned about the new technology's safety and dignity, but after his first flight, he became an enthusiastic convert, using helicopters regularly for trips to Camp David and Andrews Air Force Base. The distinctive Marine One helicopter, with its white top, became a presidential icon. Today, we take presidential helicopter use for granted, but Eisenhower's willingness to embrace this innovation changed executive transportation forever. His successor would embrace different forms of innovation and achievement, becoming the first president to reach literary heights that eluded all others. Chapter 46, Kennedy's Pulitzer Achievement. John F. Kennedy won a Pulitzer Prize in 1957 for his book Profiles in Courage, making him the only president ever to receive this honor. The book examined 8 U.S. senators who defied popular opinion to do what they believed was right. Kennedy wrote most of it while recovering from back surgery in 1954 and 1955. However, controversy has long surrounded the book's authorship. Historian Herbert Parmet and others have argued that Kennedy's speechwriter, Ted Sorensen, did substantial writing and research, with Kennedy providing ideas and editing. Sorensen has acknowledged significant contribution, but maintained Kennedy deserved primary authorship credit. The Pulitzer Board has never rescinded the prize, and Kennedy's name remains on the award. Regardless of authorship debates, Profiles in Courage became a bestseller and enhanced Kennedy's intellectual reputation before his presidential run. The book's success helped brand Kennedy as a serious thinker, not just a handsome politician. But Kennedy's wartime courage was undisputed, memorialized in an unusual way. Chapter 47, Kennedy's Coconut Shell. John F. Kennedy had a coconut shell carved with a rescue message that helped save his life in World War II. In August 1943, Kennedy commanded PT-109 in the Solomon Islands when a Japanese destroyer rammed and sank his patrol boat. Kennedy and surviving crew members swam to a small island. With no radio and little hope of rescue, Kennedy carved a message into a coconut shell. Naro es la, Commander, native knows posit, can pilot, 11 alive, need small boat, Kennedy. He gave the coconut to 2 native scouts who delivered it to Allied forces. Rescuers arrived days later, saving Kennedy and his crew. Kennedy kept that coconut shell for life, eventually having it mounted on a wooden base that served as a paperweight on his presidential desk. The coconut symbolized Kennedy's wartime heroism, which became central to his political identity. His successor would also embrace wartime service, though his approach to presidential conduct proved considerably less dignified. Chapter 48, Johnson's Bathroom, Briefings. Lyndon B. Johnson conducted meetings from the bathroom, calling it efficient multitasking. LBJ was notorious for working every waking moment, and bathroom time was no exception. He'd sit on the toilet with the door open, continuing conversations with aides, advisors, and even legislators. Johnson saw nothing unusual about this behavior. If you were discussing policy with LBJ and he needed to use the facilities, you were expected to follow and continue talking. He'd shower while giving orders, shave while conducting interviews, and famously conduct entire meetings while sitting on the toilet conducting his business. Staff members found this mortifying, but Johnson didn't care about their discomfort. He believed every minute counted, and bodily functions shouldn't interrupt important work. This bathroom meeting habit revealed Johnson's domineering personality. He controlled every interaction, forcing others into subordinate positions both literally and figuratively. LBJ's intimidation tactics didn't stop at bathroom politics. His automotive adventures proved equally aggressive. Chapter 49, Johnson's Amphibious Pranks. Lyndon B. Johnson gave interviews while driving his amphibious car straight into lakes, terrifying passengers. LBJ owned an amphicar, a German-made vehicle that functioned as both car and boat. Johnson delighted in pranking unsuspecting guests at his Texas ranch. He'd invite someone for a drive, then head toward a lake at high speed, shouting that the brakes had failed. As his passenger screamed in terror, Johnson would drive straight into the water, where the car would float and motor along as a boat. Johnson would laugh hysterically at his victim's panic. He pulled this stunt repeatedly on visitors, journalists, and even Secret Service agents who weren't in on the joke. The prank revealed Johnson's cruel sense of humor. He enjoyed dominating and frightening people, but it also showed his boyish enthusiasm for gadgets and practical jokes. LBJ's larger-than-life personality made him simultaneously effective and insufferable. His successor was considerably more reserved, though he harbored surprising artistic talents. Chapter 50, Nixon the Musician. Richard Nixon played 5 musical instruments and composed his own piano concerto. Nixon was genuinely musically talented, playing piano, violin, clarinet, saxophone, and accordion. He began piano lessons at age 7 and continued throughout his life. As president, Nixon would sometimes play piano at White House gatherings, performing classical pieces and show tunes. In 1950, he composed Piano Concerto in C minor, a serious musical work that demonstrated legitimate compositional skill, not just presidential dabbling. The piece was later performed publicly, though critics noted its derivative style borrowed heavily from Romantic-era composers. Nixon loved attending musical performances and discussing classical music with visiting artists. His musical ability humanized him somewhat, showing depth beyond his political calculating. Music provided Nixon emotional outlet and stress relief, especially during Watergate's pressures. But Nixon's White House also witnessed stranger encounters, including one with rock and roll royalty high on drugs. Chapter 51, Nixon Meets the King, Richard. Nixon met Elvis Presley in the White House on December 21st, 1970. Elvis, high on multiple drugs, though Nixon didn't know it, requested the meeting because he wanted to be made a federal agent at large for the Bureau of Narcotics. The irony was spectacular. Elvis, massively abusing prescription drugs, wanted drug enforcement credentials. Nixon agreed to the bizarre meeting, and photos show them shaking hands, Elvis wearing a purple velvet suit and enormous gold belt. Elvis brought Nixon a World War II-era Colt 45 pistol as a gift, rambled about his concerns about drug culture and anti-American sentiment, and received an honorary badge. The whole encounter was surreal. The uptight president and drugged-out rock star pretending they understood each other. The photos later became among the most requested from the National Archives. Elvis kept his Bureau of Narcotics badge until his death from drug-related causes in 1977. Nixon's successor brought considerably different energy to the White House, including an unexpected modeling background. Chapter 52, Ford the Model. Gerald Ford was once a fashion model for Cosmopolitan and other magazines in the 1930s and 1940s. Before entering law and politics, Ford modeled professionally to pay for college and law school. He appeared on the cover of Cosmopolitan magazine in 1942, looking ruggedly handsome in his Navy uniform. Ford also modeled for Look magazine and did catalog work. His modeling career wasn't extensive, but it was legitimate. He actually earned money modeling, not just posing for a publicity photo. Ford's good looks and athletic build made him natural model material. He'd been a star football player at University of Michigan, chosen as the team's most valuable player in 1934, and turned down offers from professional football teams to attend Yale Law School. Ford's modeling work helped finance his education during the Depression when money was tight. His modeling background resurfaced occasionally during his presidency, usually as amusing trivia. But Ford became better known for different physical performances, specifically his spectacular clumsiness. Chapter 53, Ford's frequent falls. Gerald Ford regularly tripped, stumbled, and fell on camera, providing endless material for Saturday Night Live. Chevy Chase built his career portraying Ford as a bumbling klutz, stumbling through press conferences and tumbling downstairs. The portrayal was completely unfair. Ford was probably the most athletic president ever, having played college football and remaining physically active. But a few high-profile stumbles created the narrative. Ford slipped on airplane stairs in Austria, bumped his head on helicopter doors, and once fell skiing in Colorado. Media coverage emphasized every stumble, and SNL mercilessly exaggerated them. Ford took the mockery graciously, even appearing on SNL himself years later. He understood that fighting the clumsy president image would only reinforce it. Ford's press secretary argued the falls happened because Ford tried to do too much, too quickly. Not because he was uncoordinated, but the damage was done. Clumsy Ford became part of political culture. His successor brought different eccentricities to office, including an otherworldly sighting. Chapter 54, Carter's UFO Report. Jimmy Carter filed an official UFO sighting report in 1973, claiming he'd witnessed an unidentified flying object in 1969. Carter described seeing a bright light in the sky near Leary, Georgia, that moved toward and away from his position, changed colors, and defied conventional explanation. He submitted detailed reports to both the International UFO Bureau and the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. Carter described the object as very bright, with changing colors and about the size of the moon. He insisted it wasn't a star, plane, or weather phenomenon. During his 1976 presidential campaign, Carter promised to release all government UFO information if elected. However, as president, Carter never followed through on this promise, presumably after intelligence briefings explained the national security complications. Scientists later suggested Carter had probably seen the planet Venus, which was unusually bright that evening, but Carter maintained he'd seen something unexplainable. Whatever he saw, Carter preferred earthbound activities after his presidency. Chapter 55. Carter's Peanut Preference. Jimmy Carter once said he loved being a peanut farmer more than being president. After losing his 1980 re-election bid to Ronald Reagan, Carter returned to Plains, Georgia, and his agricultural roots. He told interviewers repeatedly that farming had brought him more satisfaction and peace than political life. Carter had grown up on a peanut farm and managed the family business before entering politics, working the land, dealing with crops and weather, solving practical problems. This work fulfilled Carter in ways politics never did. The presidency had been frustrating for Carter. He'd faced the Iran hostage crisis, economic stagflation, energy crises, and constant political opposition. His earnest, moralistic approach seemed ill-suited to Washington's cynical game-playing. In retirement, Carter built an extraordinary post-presidential career through Habitat for Humanity, election monitoring, and diplomatic work that eventually earned him the Nobel Peace Prize. But he insisted the simple life of farming had been happiest. His successor came from a completely different world, Hollywood. Chapter 56. Reagan's Twilight Zone. Audition: Ronald Reagan was seriously considered to host the Twilight Zone television series in the late 1950s. Creator Rod Serling nearly chose Reagan before ultimately selecting himself as host. Reagan had extensive acting and hosting experience from his Hollywood career and his work hosting General Electric Theater from 1954 to 1962. He could deliver dramatic narration convincingly, making him a natural fit for Twilight Zone's eerie introductions. Serling respected Reagan's on-camera presence and considered him seriously for the role. However, Serling ultimately decided to host himself, creating one of television's most iconic presences. Imagine alternate history where Reagan became the face of Twilight Zone instead of president. His theatrical skills, developed through hosting various programs, definitely prepared him for the performative aspects of the presidency. Reagan understood visual media better than any previous president, using television masterfully to communicate directly with Americans. That communication skill would serve him well during his presidency's darkest moment. Chapter 57. Reagan's Surgical Joke. Ronald Reagan survived an assassination attempt on March 30th, 1981, and joked with his doctors, "I hope you're all Republicans." John Hinckley Jr. shot Reagan outside the Washington Hilton Hotel. The bullet ricocheted off the presidential limousine and struck Reagan under his left arm, piercing his lung and stopping inches from his heart. Despite severe internal bleeding, Reagan walked into George Washington University Hospital under his own power before collapsing. As surgeons prepared emergency surgery, Reagan looked up at the medical team and delivered his now famous quip about hoping they were Republicans. The lead surgeon, a liberal Democrat, replied, "Today, Mr. President, we're all Republicans." Reagan's humor under literally life-threatening circumstances epitomized his public persona. Unflappable, optimistic, and naturally charming even facing death. He survived surgery successfully and recovered remarkably well for a 70-year-old gunshot victim. Reagan's grace under pressure enhanced his popularity enormously. His successor would face less dramatic but equally memorable physical mishaps. Chapter 58. Bush's Tokyo Incident. George H.W. Bush threw up on the Japanese Prime Minister Kiichi Miyazawa during a state dinner in Tokyo on January 8, 1992. Bush was suffering from gastroenteritis but insisted on attending the formal dinner despite feeling ill. Seated next to Prime Minister Miyazawa, Bush suddenly vomited into Miyazawa's lap, then fainted, slumping under the table. Secret Service immediately surrounded the president while Miyazawa, covered in vomit, maintained diplomatic composure. Bush recovered quickly, but the incident was captured on camera and broadcast worldwide. It became instant global news, the leader of the free world puking on Japan's prime minister, then passing out. Japanese media invented a new word for it, bushusuru, meaning to do the Bush thing, or to vomit publicly. Bush was mortified, but joked about it later, noting it certainly broke the ice diplomatically. The incident humanized Bush, showing even presidents get stomach flu. But Bush would prove his physical vigor in more positive ways later in retirement. Chapter 59. Bush's sky-high birthday, George H. W. Bush celebrated his 90th birthday on June 12, 2014, by skydiving. This wasn't his first jump. Bush had jumped on his 75th, 80th, and 85th birthdays too, making it a quinquennial tradition. His first parachute jump had been in 1944, when his Navy torpedo bomber was shot down over the Pacific during World War II. Bush bailed out, parachuting into the ocean, where a submarine eventually rescued him. That experience could have traumatized him, but instead Bush found parachuting exhilarating. In retirement, he took up recreational skydiving, jumping tandem with military parachute teams. His 90th birthday jump, despite his age and health issues including Parkinson's disease, demonstrated Bush's adventurous spirit never dimmed. Former President Bush couldn't walk unassisted by then, but absolutely insisted on this final jump. He landed safely, beaming. It was a remarkable capstone to an active life. Meanwhile, his successor brought considerably different performance skills to the presidency. Chapter 60. Clinton's musical moment. Bill Clinton played saxophone on the Arsenio Hall show on June 3, 1992, while wearing sunglasses, creating an iconic campaign moment. Clinton, then running for president, performed Heartbreak Hotel wearing dark sunglasses, looking relaxed and cool. The appearance was strategically brilliant. It showed Clinton as a regular guy, comfortable in popular culture, unlike his stiff opponent President Bush. Clinton's saxophone skills were genuine. He'd played seriously in high school, even considering professional music before choosing politics. His Arsenio Hall appearance reached younger, diverse audiences who didn't watch traditional political programs. Critics called it undignified, reducing the presidency to entertainment. But Clinton understood modern media. Presidential candidates needed to meet voters where they were, including late-night television. The performance humanized Clinton and reinforced his man from hope narrative, someone who understood regular Americans' lives. It marked the beginning of politicians using entertainment media as legitimate campaign strategy, a practice now completely normalized. Clinton's cultural fluency helped him win the presidency that November. Chapter 61. Clinton's space-age communication. Bill Clinton sent the first presidential email to astronaut John Glenn aboard the Space Shuttle Discovery on November 6, 1998. The email was brief. Dear John, Hillary and I had a great time at the launch. We are very proud of you and the entire crew, and a little jealous. You're a true American hero. Warmest regards, Bill Clinton. This historic message traveled from Earth to space digitally, marking a new era of presidential communication. Glenn, 77 years old, had returned to space 36 years after becoming the first American to orbit Earth in 1962. Clinton's email demonstrated how technology had transformed both space exploration and presidential communication since Kennedy's era. The White House had only recently embraced email, installing its first internet connection in 1993. Clinton himself was still learning to use computers, but he recognized the symbolic importance of this message. His successor would face a different kind of projectile, though considerably less friendly than electronic messages. Chapter 62. Bush's shoe-dodging reflexes. George W. Bush dodged 2 shoes thrown at him during a press conference in Baghdad on December 14th, 2008. Iraqi journalist Muntadar al-Zaidi hurled both his shoes at Bush while shouting in Arabic, "This is a farewell kiss from the Iraqi people, you dog." Bush displayed impressive reflexes, ducking both shoes while smiling. In Middle Eastern culture, throwing shoes at someone is a serious insult, showing the soles of your feet being deeply disrespectful. Al-Zaidi became briefly famous in parts of the Middle East for his protest, though he was arrested and imprisoned. Bush joked about the incident afterward, saying, "If you want the facts, it's a size 10 shoe that he threw." The president seemed almost amused by the attack, maintaining composure throughout. His athletic background helped him avoid both projectiles smoothly. And speaking of Bush's athletic past, his college years featured activities many found surprising for a future president. Chapter 63, Bush the Cheerleader. George W. Bush was a cheerleader at Yale University during his undergraduate years in the mid-1960s. This fact surprised many who knew Bush as a Texas cowboy type, but Bush cheerleaded enthusiastically at Yale, leading crowd cheers at football and basketball games. Photos show him in white sweater and megaphone, rallying Bulldog fans. Bush was head cheerleader his senior year, a position of significant social standing at Yale. Cheerleading wasn't then, and isn't now, exclusively female, and many male politicians have cheerleading backgrounds. Bush embraced his cheerleading past without embarrassment, seeing it as leadership experience. Critics occasionally mocked it, but Bush noted cheerleading required public speaking skills, crowd management, and showmanship, all useful in politics. His Yale years were privileged and sometimes aimless, but cheerleading taught him performance skills he'd use in political campaigns decades later. His presidential successor brought entirely different interests to the White House, rooted in completely different cultural touchstones. Chapter 64, Obama's Comic Collection. Barack Obama collected comic books as a child, with Spider-Man and Conan the Barbarian among his favorites. Obama grew up reading comics voraciously, particularly drawn to Spider-Man's relatable struggles balancing responsibility with personal life. Spider-Man was a working-class hero from Queens, dealing with everyday problems alongside superhero duties, a narrative that resonated with Obama. He also loved Conan the Barbarian comics, enjoying their fantasy adventures and artwork. Obama's comic book fandom wasn't just childhood nostalgia. He referenced these characters occasionally as president, understanding their cultural significance. In 2014, Obama appeared in an issue of Spider-Man comic, meeting the web-slinger in a story celebrating his presidency. Comics had influenced Obama's worldview subtly, teaching him about heroism, responsibility, and justice through illustrated narratives. His childhood reading material reflected broader cultural shifts. Comics were becoming respectable mainstream entertainment, not just kids' stuff, but Obama didn't just consume culture, he created some himself in the White House. Chapter 65, Obama's White House Brewery. Obama brewed beer in the White House, creating White House Honey Ale, using honey from Michelle Obama's South Lawn garden. This made Obama the first president to brew beer on White House grounds. The beer-making operation began in 2011, with White House chefs developing the recipe. They used honey harvested from beehives Michelle Obama had installed as part of her healthy eating initiative. The beer became surprisingly popular, with visitors requesting tastes and citizens demanding the recipe. The White House eventually released the recipe publicly in 2012 after thousands of Freedom of Information Act requests. White House Honey Ale became a symbol of Obama's relatability, a president who enjoyed craft beer and wasn't afraid to seem ordinary. The brewing operation was small-scale and mostly symbolic, but it represented Obama's attempt to demystify the presidency while maintaining dignity. His successor would take a radically different approach to presidential image-making, rooted in his entertainment background. Chapter 66, Trump's Hollywood star, Donald Trump is the only president with a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, awarded in 2007 for his work on The Apprentice. Trump's star at 6700 Hollywood Boulevard honors his contributions to television. The Apprentice and Celebrity Apprentice were enormously successful reality shows from 2004 to 2015, making "You're fired" a catchphrase. Trump's entertainment career predated his presidency by decades, including cameos in movies like Home Alone 2 and Zoolander. His Hollywood star became controversial after his presidential campaign, with vandals repeatedly damaging it. The star has been smashed, spray painted, and targeted with pickaxes multiple times, requiring frequent repairs. Love him or hate him, Trump's star represents his unique path to presidency through entertainment rather than traditional political or military service. No previous president had been primarily known as a television personality before seeking office, and Trump's unconventional presidential actions weren't limited to his entertainment background. Chapter 67, Trump's Greenland Gambit. Donald Trump seriously tried to buy Greenland from Denmark in 2019. The Washington Post first reported Trump's interest in purchasing the autonomous Danish territory, which has significant strategic and natural resource value. Trump confirmed his interest, calling it essentially a large real estate deal. He'd discussed Greenland's purchase with advisors and was genuinely interested. Denmark's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen called the idea absurd, saying Greenland wasn't for sale. Trump reacted angrily to this rejection, canceling a planned state visit to Denmark and calling Frederiksen's comments nasty. The idea wasn't entirely unprecedented. The United States had previously tried purchasing Greenland in 1867 and again in 1946. Greenland has military bases, rare earth minerals, and strategic Arctic positioning, making it genuinely valuable. But modern geopolitics and Greenland's self-governance made the proposal politically impossible. Trump's Greenland Gambit perfectly captured his transactional worldview and real estate developer mentality applied to international relations. His successor would prove considerably more traditional in diplomatic approach, though his personal journey to the presidency involved overcoming significant obstacles. Chapter 68, Biden's Stuttering Journey. Biden had a severe stutter as a child and overcame it through poetry recitation and persistent practice. Biden's stutter was so bad that classmates mocked him, calling him Dash and Joe Impedimenta. Teachers sometimes treated his stutter as behavioral rather than neurological, adding to his humiliation. Biden worked relentlessly to control his stutter, standing in front of mirrors reciting poetry, particularly Irish poets like Yeats. He'd practice for hours, training himself to speak more fluently. Biden has said his stutter taught him empathy for others facing obstacles and disadvantages. As president, Biden occasionally still shows traces of his childhood stutter, particularly when tired or stressed. He's been remarkably open about this struggle, meeting with young people who stutter and encouraging them. Biden's openness about disability broke presidential precedent. Few presidents had discussed personal vulnerabilities so candidly. His willingness to show this weakness actually strengthened his connection with many Americans. But Biden's modernity showed in other ways too, including his exercise equipment choices. Chapter 69, Biden's Peloton Problem. Joe Biden is the first president to own a Peloton bike, which caused minor security panic when he took office. Biden was an avid Peloton user during the campaign, taking cycling classes via the bike's internet-connected screen. When Biden became president-elect, cybersecurity experts raised concerns about the Peloton's built-in camera, microphone, and internet connectivity. The bike could theoretically be hacked to spy on presidential activities or conversations. Secret Service and White House cybersecurity teams had to evaluate whether Biden could keep using his Peloton. They eventually developed security protocols allowing Biden to continue cycling, likely involving disabled connectivity features or secured networks. The incident highlighted how modern technology creates presidential security challenges previous generations never imagined. Eisenhower's putting green needed no debugging. Biden's Peloton represented both his personal fitness commitment and the headaches technology brings to presidential life. But technological challenges were far simpler in earlier presidential retirements, when former presidents could pursue more traditional entrepreneurial ventures. Chapter 70: Washington's Whiskey Business. George Washington distilled his own whiskey after retiring from the presidency, operating one of America's largest distilleries at Mount Vernon. Washington's Scottish farm manager James Anderson convinced him in 1797 that whiskey production would be profitable. By 1799, Washington's distillery was producing 11,000 gallons annually, making it among the nation's largest whiskey operations. The distillery employed 5 enslaved workers who did the actual labor. Washington's whiskey sold well throughout Virginia and beyond, generating substantial income. Washington died in 1799, and the distillery continued briefly under his estate before burning down in 1814. Modern Mount Vernon has reconstructed the distillery using Washington's original methods. They produce limited quantities of Washington's whiskey using his recipes, selling bottles to tourists. Washington's entrepreneurial spirit didn't end with his presidency. He actively pursued profitable ventures in retirement, including whiskey production that would probably raise eyebrows today. But Washington wasn't the only founding father interested in importing and promoting new foods and beverages to America. Chapter 71: Jefferson's Pasta Obsession. Thomas Jefferson imported pasta-making equipment from Italy and helped introduce macaroni to America. During his time as ambassador to France in the 1780s, Jefferson fell in love with European cuisine, particularly pasta. He brought back a pasta-making machine and copious notes on pasta preparation. Jefferson served macaroni at White House dinners, scandalizing some guests who found foreign foods suspicious. He also popularized ice cream, French fries, and French wine in America. Jefferson's macaroni and cheese recipe still exists in historical records, showing his detailed attention to cooking. He didn't invent macaroni and cheese, but he definitely popularized it among American elite society. Jefferson's Monticello included extensive gardens producing vegetables for his experimental cooking. His culinary curiosity reflected his broader intellectual appetite. Everything interested Jefferson, from architecture to agriculture to pasta making. He believed good food was civilized living, not mere sustenance. Jefferson's influence on American food culture was substantial and lasting. But his parallel with John Adams extended beyond politics and philosophy to their final moments. Chapter 72: Adams and Jefferson's simultaneous deaths. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both died on July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. This extraordinary coincidence seemed almost supernatural to Americans of that era. Adams died in Quincy, Massachusetts, around 6 p.m., his last words reportedly being, "Thomas Jefferson survives." But Jefferson had actually died several hours earlier at Monticello in Virginia, around 12:50 p.m. Neither man knew the other had died. The two had been revolutionary allies, then bitter political enemies, then reconciled friends through correspondence in their final years. Their simultaneous deaths on Independence Day's 50th anniversary seemed impossibly symbolic, as though the founding generation was consciously exiting history's stage together. Americans interpreted their deaths as providential, a sign that the Declaration's authors had been divinely blessed. Modern historians note that both men were elderly and ill, making death unsurprising, but the timing remains remarkable. Their parallel exits couldn't have been more dramatically appropriate, but not every presidential exit was peaceful. Some involved considerably more violence. Chapter 73: Jackson's Fatal Duel. Andrew Jackson survived a duel in 1806 and killed his opponent. Charles Dickinson, one of Tennessee's best marksmen. The duel resulted from complex disputes involving horse racing debts and insults to Jackson's wife, Rachel. Dickinson had made remarks questioning Rachel's virtue and the timing of her divorce and remarriage to Jackson. Jackson challenged him to a duel, which took place in Kentucky. The rules were simple: stand 24 feet apart and fire. Dickinson shot first, hitting Jackson in the chest near his heart. Jackson somehow remained standing despite the severe wound. Jackson then took careful aim and shot Dickinson in the abdomen. Dickinson died hours later. Jackson carried Dickinson's bullet near his heart for the rest of his life, as it was too dangerous to remove. The wound caused Jackson chronic pain and occasional bleeding throughout his presidency. Jackson's willingness to kill over his wife's honor revealed his fierce, uncompromising nature. That same intensity characterized his presidency decades later. His distant successor, Theodore Roosevelt, would prove equally intense, though in different ways. Chapter 74: Roosevelt's Reading Machine. Theodore Roosevelt had a photographic memory and read approximately one book daily throughout his adult life. Roosevelt's reading speed was phenomenal. He could absorb a page at a glance and retain virtually everything. His personal library contained thousands of volumes on every imaginable subject. Roosevelt read science, history, science, poetry, novels, military strategy, natural history, and political philosophy voraciously. He could quote extensively from memory and frequently cited obscure references in conversations and speeches. Roosevelt read in multiple languages, including French and German. Even as president, with crushing responsibilities, Roosevelt carved out daily reading time. He'd read during breakfast, before bed, and whenever brief moments allowed. Visitors often found him simultaneously reading and conducting conversations. Roosevelt's intellectual appetite matched his physical energy. Both seemed inexhaustible. His photographic memory gave him vast knowledge that informed his policy decisions and made him a formidable debater. Few presidents have matched Roosevelt's combination of intellectual brilliance and physical vigor. But another president combined very different skills in an unexpected profession. Chapter 75: Lincoln the Bartender. Abraham Lincoln was a licensed bartender, co-owning a tavern in New Salem, Illinois, in 1833. Lincoln and his partner William Berry ran Berry and Lincoln, a general store that held a liquor license, allowing them to sell alcoholic beverages by the drink. This made Lincoln technically a saloon keeper and bartender. The business failed within a year. Berry drank too much of the inventory, and neither partner had business sense. Lincoln called the debts from this failed venture the national debt, taking years to repay them completely. But Lincoln's bartending license was real, making him the only president who could legally serve you a drink professionally. This fact seems incongruous with Lincoln's later image as the somber great emancipator. But young Lincoln was rough-edged, telling bawdy stories and wrestling in frontier towns. The polished President Lincoln we remember was built over decades of self-education and refinement. His bartending past showed his humble origins and willingness to try any honest work. Meanwhile, another president's honest work involved moving considerably faster than legal limits allowed. Chapter 76: Grant's Repeat Offense. Ulysses S. Grant received multiple speeding tickets for riding his horse too fast through Washington streets. We've previously mentioned Grant's first ticket, but it wasn't an isolated incident. Grant simply could not resist racing through city streets on horseback or in his horse and buggy. He was a magnificent horseman, probably the best equestrian ever to serve as president, and loved speed. His Civil War reputation included daring horseback rides through dangerous territory. As president, Grant maintained this reckless riding, repeatedly violating Washington's speed ordinances. Police officers recognized him but issued citations anyway, unwilling to give the president a pass. Grant always paid his fines without complaint, respecting the law even when he'd broken it. His need for speed revealed a risk-taking personality that loved action and movement. Grant never adjusted to the sedentary aspects of peacetime leadership. He craved the adrenaline and motion of wartime, and fast riding provided a pale substitute. His successor would contribute to presidential traditions in a completely different arena. Chapter 77. Taft's first pitch. William Howard Taft started the tradition of presidents throwing out the ceremonial first pitch at baseball games. On April 14, 1910, Taft attended the Washington Senators' opening day game against the Philadelphia Athletics. When asked to throw out the first ball, Taft obliged, standing in his seat and tossing the ball toward the field. The gesture was spontaneous, not planned as a formal ceremony. But it was so popular that it became an instant tradition. Every subsequent president has thrown ceremonial first pitches, making it an expected presidential duty. Baseball was America's undisputed national pastime in 1910, and Taft's participation symbolized presidential connection to ordinary Americans' leisure. Taft himself was a baseball fan who genuinely enjoyed the sport. His first pitch tradition has endured over a century, surviving countless changes in presidential protocol. It remains one of few truly bipartisan presidential activities. Presidents of both parties throw first pitches without controversy. Taft's spontaneous gesture became permanent presidential tradition. Another president would use a different medium to connect with Americans during national crisis. Chapter 78. Roosevelt's Fireside Chats. Franklin D. Roosevelt gave 30 fireside chats between 1933 and 1944, using radio to communicate directly with Americans. These evening radio addresses helped calm public panic during the Great Depression and World War II. Roosevelt's warm, conversational tone made listeners feel he was speaking personally to them, sitting by their fireplace. The first fireside chat, delivered March 12, 1933, addressed the banking crisis. Roosevelt explained complex financial issues in simple terms, restoring confidence in banks overnight. Subsequent chats covered everything from drought relief to European war threats. Radio gave FDR unprecedented ability to bypass newspapers and speak directly to citizens. An estimated 60 million Americans listened to major fireside chats, about half the population. Roosevelt understood radio's intimate nature perfectly, speaking as though addressing a small living room gathering rather than millions. His conversational style revolutionized political communication. Fireside chats were carefully scripted, but sounded spontaneous, showing FDR's masterful political theater. A later president would demonstrate different communication achievements through physical presence rather than broadcast media. Chapter 79. Nixon's 50-state achievement. Richard Nixon visited all 50 states during his political career, the first president to accomplish this feat. Nixon's 50-state achievement reflected his relentless campaigning and political ambition. As vice president under Eisenhower from 1953 to 1961, Nixon traveled extensively, visiting every state. His 1960 presidential campaign took him to all 50 states, including Alaska and Hawaii, which had just achieved statehood in 1959. Nixon believed in physical presence and personal campaigning, convinced that seeing candidates in person swayed voters. His 50-state strategy in 1960 exhausted him and probably contributed to his narrow loss to Kennedy. But Nixon took pride in the achievement, noting no previous president had visited every state. Later presidents would follow Nixon's example, making 50-state presence an expected campaign accomplishment. Nixon's endless travel revealed his work ethic and political hunger. He wanted to be everywhere, meet everyone, leave nothing to chance. This same intense striving would later drive him to Watergate's illegal tactics, but Nixon's legacy wasn't entirely negative. He signed important legislation that endured. Chapter 80. Reagan and King Day. Ronald Reagan signed legislation creating Martin Luther King Jr. Day as a federal holiday on November 2nd, 1983. The bill made the third Monday of January a federal holiday, honoring the slain civil rights leader. Reagan initially opposed the holiday, questioning its cost and whether King deserved the honor. Only two other individuals, George Washington and Christopher Columbus, had federal holidays, but overwhelming congressional support and public pressure convinced Reagan to sign. The bill passed the Senate 78-22 and the House 338-90. Stevie Wonder's song Happy Birthday, advocating for the holiday, had helped build popular momentum. Reagan signed the bill in a Rose Garden ceremony, praising King's contributions while notably avoiding King's more radical positions on economic justice and Vietnam War opposition. The first official observance was January 20th, 1986. King's holiday represented gradual acceptance of civil rights movement's legacy into American mainstream, though debates about King's full vision continue. Reagan's signature, however reluctant, made King's commemoration permanent national ritual. Chapter 81. Obama's Grammy Collection. Barack Obama won Grammy Awards for audiobook narration, not once, but 3 times. Obama received the Best Spoken Word Album Grammy in 2006 for Dreams from My Father, in 2008 for The Audacity of Hope, and in 2022 for A Promised Land. These awards placed Obama in select company. Only a handful of presidents have won Grammys, including Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and all 3 for spoken word recordings. Obama's audiobook performances showcased his oratorical skills, the same abilities that powered his political rise. His voice, measured, thoughtful, conversational, translated beautifully to audiobook format. The 2022 Grammy came after his presidency ended, proving his cultural relevance extended beyond political office. Obama reading his own memoir allowed listeners to hear his story with his intended emphasis and emotion. His 3 Grammys made him the most awarded president in Grammy history. But presidential pets have always generated attention too, and one president's choice of companion was particularly unusual. Chapter 82. Coolidge's raccoon roommates. Calvin Coolidge had pet raccoons named Rebecca and Horace that roamed the White House freely. Rebecca arrived first in November 1926, originally intended as Thanksgiving dinner. The Coolidges were sent the raccoon from Mississippi, where eating raccoon was traditional. But Grace Coolidge refused to cook Rebecca, adopting her as a pet instead. Rebecca had an embroidered collar, walked on a leash, and enjoyed climbing trees on White House grounds. She had her own house outside, but often wandered indoors. Horace joined later as Rebecca's companion. The raccoons became media sensations, with newspapers reporting their antics regularly. Rebecca particularly enjoyed being bathed in the bathtub and would splash water everywhere. She attended Easter egg rolls and other White House events. When the Coolidges left office in 1929, they donated Rebecca to the National Zoo, where she lived out her days. The raccoons perfectly captured the Coolidge era's quirky charm. But not every former president's later life choices were quite so wholesome. Chapter 83. Tyler's Confederate Betrayal. John Tyler was elected to the Confederate House of Representatives in November 1861, the only former president to serve the Confederacy. Tyler had initially supported compromise efforts to prevent civil war. But when Virginia seceded in April 1861, Tyler sided firmly with the Confederacy. He chaired the Virginia Secession Convention and actively recruited Virginia into the Confederate cause. Tyler's decision to support rebellion against the country he had once led shocked Northerners. He'd been president from 1841 to 1845, yet 20 years later fought to destroy the Union. Tyler won election to the Confederate Congress representing Virginia, but died in January 1862 before taking his seat. Because of his Confederate service, the U.S. government didn't officially recognize Tyler's death. No flags flew at half-staff. He's the only president whose death Washington didn't officially mourn. Tyler's grave eventually received a Confederate headstone. His Confederate loyalty stained his presidential legacy permanently. But Tyler wasn't the only president with complicated relationships to national service. Chapter 84: Carter's Nuclear Mission. Jimmy Carter once led a dangerous mission to shut down a damaged nuclear reactor at Chalk River in Ontario, Canada, in December 1952. Carter was a young Navy lieutenant working under Admiral Hyman Rickover in the nuclear submarine program. The Chalk River reactor had suffered a partial meltdown, with radioactive water flooding the reactor building. Someone needed to enter the contaminated area to disassemble the damaged reactor core. Carter volunteered to lead the team. He and his crew built an exact replica of the reactor to practice their procedure. Then they entered the damaged reactor in 90-second shifts, the maximum safe exposure time. Each team member could work only briefly before radiation exposure forced rotation. Carter absorbed significant radiation during his shift, though apparently not enough to cause lasting harm. This experience gave Carter deep understanding of nuclear technology and its dangers, shaping his later presidency's energy and arms control policies. Few presidents had Carter's technical expertise in genuinely dangerous technologies, but technical competence doesn't guarantee personal dignity, as one vice president's inauguration proved. Chapter 85: Johnson's Drunken Disgrace. Andrew Johnson appeared publicly drunk at Abraham Lincoln's second inauguration on March 4th, 1865. Johnson had been ill with typhoid fever and was recovering in Nashville. He asked outgoing Vice President Hannibal Hamlin for whiskey to steady himself before the ceremony. Hamlin provided 3 glasses. Johnson drank them quickly on an empty stomach, then proceeded to give a rambling, incoherent vice presidential inaugural speech. Johnson slurred his words, spoke too long, and made little sense. The audience was mortified. Lincoln reportedly told the marshal of the inauguration, "Do not let Johnson speak outside." Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles wrote in his diary that Johnson made a rambling and strange harangue that disgusted everyone. Johnson later claimed illness and medication had affected him, not alcohol alone, but witnesses clearly saw him intoxicated. 6 weeks later, Lincoln's assassination made the drunken Johnson president, beginning one of the most contentious presidencies in American history. Johnson's public intoxication at Lincoln's inauguration foreshadowed his chaotic tenure. Chapter 86: Buchanan's Slavery Paradox. James Buchanan purchased enslaved people with the stated intention of freeing them, though the morality of this practice remains deeply problematic. Buchanan personally opposed slavery's expansion, but also opposed abolition. He bought enslaved people in Washington, D.C., and Pennsylvania, then legally freed them after required service periods. This allowed Buchanan to claim he'd freed slaves without actually fighting slavery's existence. The practice was ethically dubious. Buying human beings to eventually free them still treated people as property. Buchanan could have simply hired free workers instead. His purchases may have salved his conscience while avoiding political confrontation with Southern Democrats, whose support he needed. Buchanan's presidency from 1857 to 1861 was catastrophically weak on slavery, allowing Southern secession to build momentum. His attempts at moderation pleased no one and helped trigger civil war. Buchanan's personal record on slavery, buying humans to free them, perfectly captured his failed attempt to walk a moral tightrope. Meanwhile, other presidents showed different kinds of questionable judgment regarding White House property. Chapter 87: Arthur's Renovation Purge. Chester A. Arthur redecorated the White House lavishly after becoming president, selling off 24 wagon loads of historical furniture and items to finance his renovations. Arthur considered existing White House furnishings shabby and beneath presidential dignity. In April 1882, he held a massive public auction selling furniture, carpets, dishes, and decorative items accumulated over decades. Some items dated back to John Adams's presidency. Arthur didn't care about historical significance. He wanted modern, fashionable interiors. He hired Louis Comfort Tiffany to redesign the White House in opulent Victorian style, adding stained glass, elaborate wallpapers, and expensive furnishings. The transformation cost enormous sums and destroyed irreplaceable historical artifacts. Arthur's auction sold items for pennies that would be worth fortunes today. His prioritization of fashion over history horrified some observers, but pleased Arthur's society friends. The redecorated White House reflected Arthur's personal taste, expensive, stylish, and utterly indifferent to the past. But Arthur's questionable choices regarding White House contents were nothing compared to another president's deeply inappropriate personal relationship. Chapter 88. Cleveland's disturbing marriage. Grover Cleveland married Frances Folsom in 1886 when he was 49 and she was 21, a 28-year age gap that was shocking even by Victorian standards. The relationship's history makes it more disturbing. Cleveland had been Frances's legal guardian since she was a child. Frances's father, Cleveland's law partner, Oscar Folsom, died when she was 11. Cleveland administered the estate and helped raise Frances, buying her first baby carriage and staying involved in her life. When Frances attended college, Cleveland's romantic interest apparently developed. He proposed shortly after her college graduation. Their White House wedding on June 2nd, 1886, was the only presidential marriage ceremony held there. The public initially celebrated the marriage, calling Frances the youngest First Lady. But modern perspectives recognize the deeply problematic power dynamics. Cleveland had guardian authority over Frances during her formative years, then married her. This relationship would today be recognized as grooming. Victorian Americans didn't question it, but contemporary understanding makes Cleveland's marriage to his former ward deeply troubling. Other presidents faced different physical challenges requiring adaptation. Chapter 89. Wilson's left-handed adaptation. Woodrow Wilson suffered a massive stroke on October 2nd, 1919, paralyzing his left side. The stroke left Wilson severely disabled, though this was hidden from the public. Wilson had been right-handed, but with his right side paralyzed, he had to adapt. Historical accounts indicate Wilson attempted to learn writing and other tasks with his left hand during his recovery, though he never regained full functionality. His wife Edith effectively ran the presidency for the remaining 17 months of his term, controlling access to Wilson and making many decisions herself. The extent of Wilson's incapacity remained secret for decades. Cabinet members were told Wilson was temporarily ill. The public never learned their president couldn't function independently. Wilson's stroke and subsequent cover-up raised serious constitutional questions about presidential disability that wouldn't be addressed until the 25th Amendment in 1967. Wilson's hidden condition represented a genuine constitutional crisis, but not all presidential innovations were hidden. Some became cherished traditions. Chapter 90. Pierce's Christmas Tree Debate. Debate Franklin. Pierce is sometimes credited with installing the first Christmas tree in the White House, though this claim is disputed among historians. Some sources indicate Pierce had a Christmas tree during his presidency in the 1850s, while others credit Benjamin Harrison with the first documented White House Christmas tree in 1889. Christmas trees weren't yet standard American tradition during Pierce's presidency. German immigrants had brought the custom to America, but it hadn't yet spread widely. If Pierce did have a Christmas tree, it would have been unusual and noteworthy. However, solid historical documentation is lacking. The confusion reflects incomplete White House records from earlier presidencies and the fact that Christmas celebrations were more private family affairs then. What's certain is that by Harrison's presidency, Christmas trees had become accepted American tradition, and Harrison's tree was well documented. Whether Pierce deserves credit for introducing this tradition remains an unresolved historical question, but some presidential traditions are undisputed, even if bizarre, by modern standards. Chapter 91: Hoover's Linguistic Dinner Companion. Herbert Hoover and his wife Lou spoke Mandarin Chinese to each other at White House dinners, often conversing in Chinese with staff or guests who shared the language. While specific details about a valet who spoke only Chinese are difficult to verify, the Hoovers' Chinese fluency is well documented. They'd both learned Mandarin while living in China from 1899 to 1901 during Herbert's mining engineering career. The Hoovers became fluent enough for complex conversations and used Chinese as their private language in the White House whenever they wanted privacy from staff, visitors, or reporters. They could discuss sensitive matters openly in rooms full of English speakers without anyone understanding. This linguistic privacy was remarkably effective. Virtually no one in Washington spoke Mandarin in the 1930s. The Hoovers' Chinese conversations must have seemed exotic and mysterious to White House staff. Their language skills reflected genuinely international backgrounds unusual for politicians of that era. But while the Hoovers' linguistic adventures were merely private, another president's romantic adventures became spectacularly public after his death. Chapter 92: Harding's Love Letters. Warren G. Harding called his mistress Carrie Phillips Duchess and wrote her dozens of passionate, sexually explicit letters over their 15-year affair. The affair lasted from 1905 to 1920, including during Harding's Senate career and presidential campaign. Harding's letters to Carrie were extraordinarily detailed and graphic, describing their sexual encounters and his longing for her. He wrote hundreds of pages of correspondence. The Republican National Committee actually paid Carrie Phillips and her husband to take an extended overseas trip during the 1920 presidential campaign, essentially bribing them to keep quiet about the affair. After Harding's death in 1923, the letters remained hidden for decades. They were finally opened to researchers in 2014 after lengthy legal battles. The letters revealed Harding as passionate, poetic, and recklessly indiscreet. He also had another affair with Nan Britton, who claimed he fathered her daughter. Harding's personal life was chaotic and scandalous, though mostly hidden during his lifetime. Other presidents bore more visible scars from their service. Chapter 93: Monroe's Revolutionary Wound. James Monroe was severely wounded at the Battle of Trenton on December 26, 1776, and carried the bullet lodged near his shoulder for the rest of his life. Monroe was 18 years old, a lieutenant leading troops across the Delaware River with Washington. During the attack on Trenton, a musket ball severed Monroe's shoulder artery. He would have died from blood loss, but a doctor named John Riker happened to be nearby and immediately clamped the artery, saving Monroe's life. The bullet remained too dangerous to remove, staying in Monroe's body for 55 more years. Monroe's wound left him with permanent limited mobility in that shoulder. His Revolutionary War service gave Monroe enormous credibility in early American politics. He'd literally bled for independence. The bullet lodged near his heart was a permanent reminder of his sacrifice and commitment. Monroe parlayed his military service into a distinguished political career, eventually becoming the 5th president. His physical reminder of revolutionary service lasted his entire life. But not every president took their civic duties quite so seriously from the beginning. Chapter 94: Taylor's First Vote. Zachary Taylor never voted in a presidential election until he ran for president himself in 1848. Taylor had been a career military officer for 40 years, constantly moving between frontier posts. Army regulations discouraged officers from political involvement, and Taylor took this seriously. He'd never established legal residence anywhere long enough to vote. Taylor claimed he'd never voted for anyone for any office his entire life. When Taylor finally voted in 1848, he voted for himself for president. Even then, he barely identified as a Whig, the party that nominated him. Taylor had no strong party loyalty and limited political opinions. The Whigs chose him purely for his military fame after his Mexican-American War victories, not for political experience or ideology. Taylor winning the presidency despite never voting perfectly illustrated his political naivete. He served only 16 months before dying in office, never developing strong political skills. His successor would eventually develop considerably different habits regarding public service and daily routines. Chapter 95: Biden's Amtrak Commute. Biden took the train to work almost every day for 36 years during his Senate career from 1973 to 2009, after his wife and infant daughter died in a car accident shortly after his first Senate election. Biden nearly resigned, but he decided to serve while commuting daily from Wilmington, Delaware to Washington, D.C. by Amtrak, so he could be home for his two surviving sons every night. Biden became known as Amtrak Joe, riding the train over 8,000 times during his Senate career. The 90-minute commute each way became Biden's routine for decades. He used train time to read briefings, meet constituents, and think about policy. Amtrak conductors and regular riders knew him personally. Biden's train commute showed his commitment to family and became central to his working-class political brand. After becoming vice president and later president, Biden remained an Amtrak advocate, pushing for infrastructure investment in passenger rail. His decades of train commuting made him unique among modern politicians, but Biden's path to presidency was traditional compared to his predecessor's unprecedented route. Chapter 96: Trump's Unprecedented Path. Donald Trump became the first president with no prior political or military service when inaugurated on January 20th, 2017. Every previous president had either held elected office, appointed government position, or served in the military before becoming president. Trump's only public service was his presidential campaign itself. His career had been in real estate development, branding, and reality television. Trump's lack of government experience was central to his political appeal. He campaigned as a Washington outsider who would drain the swamp. Critics argued his inexperience left him unprepared for presidential responsibilities. Supporters countered that his business background brought fresh perspective to government. Trump's presidency proved divisive partly because he approached the office without traditional political training or norms. Whether his outsider status was advantage or disadvantage remains debated, but Trump broke the pattern of presidents rising through political or military ranks, opening the presidency to candidates from entirely different backgrounds. Other presidents had taken more traditional paths, including one who achieved remarkable military recognition while still a teenager. Chapter 97: Bush's Young Wings. George H.W. Bush became the youngest naval aviator in U.S. history when he received his wings on June 9, 1943, at age 18. Bush had enlisted in the Navy on his 18th birthday, the day after graduating from Phillips Academy. He completed flight training just before turning 19, earning his wings and commission as the Navy's youngest aviator at that time. Bush flew 58 combat missions during World War II as a torpedo bomber pilot. On September 2, 1944, Bush's plane was hit by Japanese anti-aircraft fire over the Pacific. He completed his bombing run despite the damage, then bailed out. Bush parachuted into the ocean, where he floated in a life raft for hours until a submarine rescued him. 2 crew members died in the incident. Bush earned the Distinguished Flying Cross for this mission and other combat service. His Navy service gave him lifelong credibility and leadership experience. Bush's youthful military achievement contrasted sharply with his later roles as diplomat, CIA director, vice president, and president. But not all presidential achievements involved such dramatic circumstances. Chapter 98: Obama's Beer Diplomacy. Barack Obama hosted the first ever White House Beer Summit on July 30th, 2009, attempting to ease racial tensions after a controversial arrest. Harvard professor Henry Louis Gates Jr., who is black, had been arrested at his own home by Cambridge police officer James Crowley, who is white, after a neighbor reported a possible break-in. The incident sparked national debate about racial profiling. Obama commented that police acted stupidly, creating political firestorm. To calm the situation, Obama invited Gates and Crowley to the White House for beers and conversation. Vice President Biden joined them. The four men sat at a table on the White House lawn, drinking beer and talking for about an hour. Media called it the Beer Summit. Obama drank Bud Light, Biden drank Buckler non-alcoholic, Crowley chose Blue Moon, and Gates had Sam Adams Light. The meeting didn't solve racial tensions, but showed Obama's attempt at personal diplomacy. Critics called it a publicity stunt. Supporters saw genuine peacemaking. The beer summit became a cultural moment, though its impact was limited. Meanwhile, some presidential moments were brief, but their consequences lasted much longer. Chapter 99. Harrison's fatal verbosity. William Henry Harrison delivered the longest inaugural address in presidential history. 1 hour and 45 minutes, totaling 8,445 words, when he could have spoken far more briefly. The contrast between what was needed and what Harrison provided was stark. A short speech might have taken 99 seconds or less, but Harrison insisted on reading his interminable address about classical history, Republican virtue, and constitutional principles. The speech was essentially a pedantic lecture, showing off Harrison's education. He spoke in cold, rainy weather on March 4th, 1841, refusing to wear a coat or hat because he wanted to appear vigorous at age 68. Harrison's excessive speech in bad weather led to pneumonia. He died exactly 1 month later on April 4th, serving the shortest presidency in history. The irony was brutal. Harrison's attempt to prove his vitality and intellect through an endless speech directly caused his death. He spoke too long and died too soon, his verbose inauguration becoming his epitaph. His longest speech led to the shortest presidency. And that brings us to the end of our presidential journey through the weird, the wild, and the occasionally disturbing corners of American leadership. From Washington refusing to shake your hand to Harrison talking himself to death, from Lincoln's wrestling career to Trump trying to buy Greenland like it was a condo in Atlantic City. We've covered centuries of presidents being gloriously, bizarrely, undeniably human. So the next time you see a presidential portrait looking all serious and dignified, just remember, that person might have brewed beer in the basement, lost government china in a poker game, or conducted important meetings while sitting on the toilet. The lesson here? Leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about being brave enough to do the job even when you have a pet raccoon destroying your bathroom, a bullet lodged near your heart, or a parrot that won't stop cursing at your funeral. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, be thankful you're not leading a nation while hiding an alligator in the bathtub, getting speeding tickets on horseback, or explaining to the Secret Service why your Peloton bike is a national security threat. Sweet dreams. And remember, if these people could run a country, you can probably handle whatever's on your to-do list tomorrow. Sleep tight.